Something was down there. For years, that was all anyone could say with any confidence. Something, beneath the mesa, in a space no one had ever entered, producing effects no one could fully explain. Cattle vanishing without a trace, equipment failing for no reason. Sinkholes opening and closing as if the earth itself was rearranging its own furniture. This is the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Season 7, and this episode is about the day that something finally got a shape. I need you to understand how carefully this had to be done. This wasn't a team chasing a headline. These are people who have spent years being wrong, being cautious, being told by their own data to wait. So when they finally identified a void beneath the surface consistent enough, structured enough, to justify breaking through, they didn't rush. They planned. They debated the risk. And then, when there was nothing left to debate, they drilled. What came back up through that opening wasn't relief. It was a colder kind of tension. Instruments behaved in ways they weren't supposed to. Cameras revealed a passage that didn't look like any cave this team had ever documented. And at the end of that passage, in a chamber none of them expected to find, something was waiting that none of them have been able to fully explain since. I'm going to take you through this discovery exactly the way it unfolded. The evidence, the doubt, the moment the room went quiet. Because by the end of this, you'll understand why the people who were there still choose their words so carefully when they talk about what they found beneath that mountain. For as long as this property has been studied, there has been a quiet, persistent suspicion that the ground itself was never simply ground. Ranchers, decades before any camera crew ever arrived, spoke of cattle vanishing without a trace, of depressions in the earth that seemed to open overnight and close just as quickly, of sounds that traveled up through the soil on windless nights when nothing above the surface could explain them. These were not campfire stories told for effect. They were reports, repeated across different owners, different decades, different people who had no reason to agree with one another, except that they were describing the same unsettling pattern. Later, when serious investigation began, that pattern didn't fade. It sharpened. Magnetometer sweeps returned anomalies that dipped and spiked in ways consistent with hollow space beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar, run across multiple seasons, kept returning to the same stubborn suggestion that somewhere beneath the mesa, the earth was not solid all the way down. Sinkholes opened in places with no prior record of collapse, swallowing equipment, altering the landscape, then behaving as though they had never existed. Each of these events, taken alone, could be dismissed. Geology is not always tidy. But taken together, across years, they built something harder to ignore. A working theory that this ranch was sitting on top of a void system, and that the void system was not simply dead space. It was reactive. It seemed to respond. That theory is the seed of everything you're about to hear, because in this season, the team stopped treating the underground as a rumor to be investigated only when convenient, and started treating it as the most promising lead the ranch had ever produced. Somewhere beneath their boots, they believed, was a structure, not just a crack in the rock, not just a natural cavity, but something with enough geometric consistency to be called, cautiously, at first only in private conversation, a tunnel. And this is the story of the day they finally decided to find out if they were right. Before anyone touched a drill, before a single shovel of earth was disturbed, the team did what any credible investigation should do. They went back to the data, and they went back to it more carefully than they ever had before. Prior geophysical surveys had marked a region beneath one section of the mesa where radar returns behaved unlike anything nearby. The signal didn't just weaken, the way it does when it passes through loose soil or scattered rock. It dropped away cleanly, then returned at a depth consistent with a continuous open space. Not a pocket, not a crack, but something with length, something with direction. They mapped it as carefully as the equipment allowed. The void appeared to run in a fairly consistent orientation, sloping gently downward before leveling off, wide enough in cross-section to be traversable, not merely a narrow seam in the rock. It did not behave like a lava tube, which tends to show telltale signs in the surrounding mineral composition. It did not behave like a natural limestone cavity, which tends to be irregular, branching unpredictably rather than holding a steady line. What they were looking at, according to more than one specialist brought in to review the data, resembled something built, or at the very least, something shaped by more than random erosion. That distinction mattered enormously to the team, and it should matter to you too, because credibility is not built on excitement, it's built on caution, and the caution here was real. Before committing to a physical breach, there were long conversations about risk, structural risk to the equipment and the people who would eventually go underground, geological risk in disturbing a formation no one fully understood, and a quieter kind of risk that rarely gets said aloud on camera but sits in the room anyway. The risk of finding something they were not prepared to explain. Reports were reviewed. Second opinions were sought. The location was cross-referenced against years of surface anomalies, strange equipment malfunctions, localized magnetic disturbances, moments where cameras positioned nearby had recorded brief, unexplained interference. If this void connected to those events, even partially, it would be the single most direct physical link the investigation had ever uncovered between what happens on the surface of this ranch and what might be happening beneath it. The decision, when it finally came, was made carefully, not impulsively. This was not a team rushing toward drama for its own sake. It was a team that had waited years for a lead this strong and had decided, after exhausting every argument for caution, that the only responsible next step was to go and look. The excavation itself was slow, deliberate, almost anticlimactic in its patience, which, if you understand how real investigations work, is exactly how it should be. There was no dramatic countdown, no theatrical buildup. There was careful drilling, incremental progress, constant monitoring of the surrounding rock for signs of instability, and long stretches of quiet concentration, punctuated by short bursts of technical conversation between the people doing the work. And then, at a depth that matched almost exactly what the radar had predicted months earlier, something changed. The resistance gave way, not violently, not with the kind of collapse you might expect from film and television. It was subtler than that, a sudden looseness in the material, a change in the sound the equipment made as it moved from solid rock into something with less mass behind it. And then, unmistakably, air. Cold air, moving upward through the breach, carrying with it a faint mineral scent that some on the team would later describe, almost apologetically, as unlike anything they associated with the surrounding rock formations. Instruments reacted almost immediately. A handheld electromagnetic field meter, positioned near the opening to monitor for exactly this possibility, registered a brief but noticeable spike. Not overwhelming, not the kind of reading that suggests equipment malfunction, but distinct enough that more than one person on the team stopped what they were doing to look at the display. A secondary thermal reading taken at the mouth of the breach showed a temperature drop sharper than would be expected simply from reaching a shaded, enclosed space. The air beneath the mesa was colder than the math alone could explain. What struck observers most, though, wasn't any single reading. It was the tone in the room, the shift from technical procedure to something quieter, more careful, almost reverent. These are people who have spent years training themselves not to react emotionally to strange data, because emotional reactions can compromise good science. And yet in that moment, according to more than one account from those present, there was a pause, a held breath, an unspoken agreement that whatever came next needed to be documented with total precision, because they might be looking at something the investigation had waited its entire existence to find. The decision was made to proceed carefully. Full documentation, redundant equipment, no rushing forward simply because curiosity demanded it. If this truly was the entrance to a long-suspected tunnel system, then everything that happened from this point forward needed to hold up to scrutiny. Camera equipment was lowered first, along with a portable lighting rig capable of illuminating the space without requiring anyone to physically enter, until visibility and structural stability could be assessed. What came back on the monitor, in those first few seconds, silenced the room. The passage did not look like a natural cave. Natural voids, even large ones, tend to carry the fingerprints of their formation. Jagged edges where rock has fractured along mineral weaknesses, irregular ceiling heights, walls that narrow and widen unpredictably as water or pressure carved their way through over centuries. What the camera revealed instead was a passage with a surprising, almost unsettling degree of consistency. The walls held a relatively uniform height. The ceiling, while not perfectly smooth, lacked the chaotic fracturing typically associated with collapse-formed cavities. The floor sloped at an angle gentle enough to walk, not one dictated by gravity pulling loose material downward over millennia. It is important to be careful here, and the team was careful, because unnatural is a heavy word, and heavy words require heavy evidence. Geologists on the team were quick to point out that certain natural processes, particularly in volcanic or heavily faulted terrain, can produce passages with more regularity than people expect. That explanation was raised immediately, and it was not dismissed. But it also did not fully satisfy everyone watching the footage, because alongside the geometry was something else. Faint, linear marks along sections of the wall, evenly spaced, running perpendicular to the direction of the passage. Tool marks, some suggested cautiously. Mineral banding, others countered. Nobody on camera was willing to commit to either explanation with confidence, and that hesitation, that visible discomfort with rushing to a conclusion, is itself part of this story. As the lighting rig pushed further in, the passage revealed a subtle downward curve, disappearing from the camera's line of sight into darkness the equipment couldn't yet penetrate. It was, by every account from those present, both thrilling and quietly unsettling, the sense of a controlled scientific procedure brushing up against something that felt, for lack of a better word, deliberate. If the visual evidence alone had been the extent of what this breakthrough produced, it would already stand as one of the most significant moments in the ranch's long investigative history. But it wasn't the extent. It was only the beginning of a deeper, more troubling pattern. As the team moved instrumentation further into the passage, magnetometers, radiation detectors, thermal imaging, the readings did something that experienced researchers rarely like to see. They disagreed with each other. At one section, roughly midway along the mapped length of the passage, magnetic readings spiked sharply before dropping back to baseline within a matter of feet, a pattern inconsistent with any known mineral deposit in the surrounding geology. Radiation levels, monitored continuously as a basic safety precaution, remained within normal background ranges for almost the entire length of the passage, until, briefly, at a location that closely correlated with the same section producing the magnetic anomaly, they ticked upward. Not to a level that raised immediate safety concerns, but enough to register clearly on the equipment, and enough to prompt an immediate cross-check with a second, independently calibrated detector to rule out malfunction. The second detector confirmed the reading. Thermal imaging added another layer to the confusion. Rather than showing a uniform temperature gradient, the kind you'd expect as you move deeper underground, insulated increasingly from surface conditions, the imaging revealed localized cold spots, small regions where the temperature dropped noticeably below the surrounding rock, with no obvious airflow or geological explanation for the difference. One team member, reviewing the footage afterward, described it as though something in that specific section of the passage was actively drawing heat out of the immediate environment, though they were careful, appropriately, not to speculate further on camera about what that might mean. Every one of these anomalies was treated first as a potential instrument error, because that is the responsible way to handle unexpected data. Equipment was swapped, calibrations were checked, redundant instruments were brought in to confirm or refute the original readings, and in each case the anomalies held. The magnetic spike returned in the same location on a second pass. The radiation uptick, however slight, was replicated by different equipment. The cold spots remained cold, hour after hour, with no clear source. What began to form, cautiously, among the team, was not a single unifying theory. Nobody was prepared to make that leap, but a growing sense that this section of the passage was somehow different from the rest of it, not structurally, not visually, but in whatever underlying physical property was producing these disagreements between instruments that, under normal circumstances, tend to behave predictably and describe the same environment in compatible ways. It was in this section, the one producing the strange readings, that the passage widened. What had been a relatively consistent corridor opened, without dramatic warning, into something larger, not a vast cavern, but a chamber substantial enough that the lighting rig, positioned at the entrance, could not fully illuminate its far wall. The team paused here longer than anywhere else, running additional structural assessments before allowing anyone to physically enter, because a chamber of this size, at this depth, carried real risk if the surrounding rock proved less stable than the passage leading into it. When entry was finally deemed safe, and a small team moved in with portable lighting and full documentation equipment, what they found waiting in that chamber was the discovery this story is built around. A discovery that, months later, researchers involved still discuss carefully, deliberately, without ever quite landing on a conclusion they're willing to defend publicly with full confidence. Positioned near the chamber's far wall, resting against the rock in a way that did not suggest it had simply fallen there or eroded into place, was a formation unlike anything documented elsewhere on the property. Accounts from those present describe it, cautiously, as having a surface texture inconsistent with the surrounding stone, smoother in places, patterned in a way that some likened, hesitantly, to something almost deliberate, though nobody was willing to commit fully to the word carved. Its edges did not match the fracture patterns visible elsewhere in the chamber. Its coloring, subtly different from the surrounding rock, suggested either a different mineral composition or exposure to conditions unlike the rest of the passage. The immediate reaction, according to those present, was a mixture of restrained professional caution and something harder to suppress. Genuine astonishment. Careful notes were taken before a single hand touched the formation. Photographs were captured from multiple angles. Measurements were recorded meticulously, because everyone in that chamber understood that whatever this turned out to be, the value of the discovery would rest entirely on the integrity of how it was documented. Working theories began to surface almost immediately, each one offered carefully, and each one, just as quickly, complicated by some detail that didn't quite fit. A natural mineral formation, shaped by unusual local conditions over an extended period, was the first and most conservative explanation raised, geologically plausible, and not dismissed outright by anyone on the team. But the regularity of certain surface patterns pushed against that explanation in ways some specialists found difficult to reconcile. A remnant of prior human activity on the property, perhaps tied to ranching infrastructure from decades past, was raised as a second possibility, except nothing in the historical record of the ranch suggested excavation reaching this depth, in this location, at any point in its documented history. And a third possibility, spoken more cautiously than the others, without anyone fully committing to it on camera, was that this formation might be connected to something older than any recorded human presence on this land at all. Something that predated every rancher, every survey, every story ever told about this place. None of these theories were confirmed. None were fully ruled out either, and that unresolved tension, the sense of standing in front of something genuinely significant without the ability to explain it, is precisely what makes this discovery so difficult to file away neatly. What followed the initial discovery was, appropriately, restraint. Rather than attempting to remove or disturb the formation immediately, the team prioritized non-invasive analysis, high-resolution imaging, careful surface scanning, and consultation with specialists outside the immediate investigation who could offer perspective without the pressure of having stood in that chamber themselves. Material analysis, conducted on small surface samples collected with extreme care, returned results that were, in their own way, as unsatisfying as they were intriguing. The composition was largely consistent with the surrounding geology, enough to rule out the more sensational theories that the formation had somehow been transported from elsewhere, or was composed of some entirely foreign material. But, largely consistent, left room for a smaller, harder-to-explain discrepancy. Trace elements present in slightly different concentrations than expected, differences small enough to fall within the range specialists debated over, rather than immediately resolved. Attempts to estimate the age or formation process of the structure produced similarly frustrating results. Certain indicators suggested a formation process consistent with long-term natural mineral deposition, potentially spanning a significant period of time. Other indicators, less conclusive, left open the possibility that the process, whatever it was, had been influenced or accelerated by conditions not fully understood, conditions that some specialists tentatively connected to the same underlying anomalies, producing the strange magnetic and radiation readings recorded just outside the chamber. In consultations that followed, opinions among specialists diverged, respectfully but genuinely. Some argued firmly for a natural explanation, citing precedent from other unusual geological formations found in similarly complex terrain elsewhere in the world. Others were less certain, pointing to the cumulative pattern of anomalies, instrument disagreement, localized cold spots, subtle radiation variants, and now a formation resistant to easy classification, as evidence that this chamber, and whatever produced it, deserved to be treated as something genuinely unresolved, rather than quietly explained away. What nobody disputed, regardless of where they landed on the formation itself, was the broader implication. This chamber did not exist in isolation. It sat at the end of a passage the team had suspected, based on years of prior data, might connect physically to some of the surface phenomena reported across this property for decades. Cattle disappearances, unexplained sinkholes, localized equipment malfunctions recorded during surface investigations in years past, some occurring in locations positioned almost directly above this newly discovered chamber. None of these connections could be proven definitively from a single expedition, but the alignment, geographically and thematically, was difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Longtime followers of this investigation will remember earlier seasons, when researchers first began mapping underground anomalies using surface-level equipment alone, years of frustratingly indirect evidence, readings that hinted at something below, without ever confirming what. This breakthrough represents the first time that indirect evidence has been met with direct physical confirmation, and in doing so, it reframes years of prior investigation, not as isolated incidents, but as fragments of a single, larger pattern the team is only now beginning to fully appreciate. It's worth pausing here to consider what this kind of finding actually means for an investigation that has spent so many years working almost entirely from indirect evidence. Surface anomalies can be debated indefinitely. A strange reading on a magnetometer can be attributed to mineral deposits, to equipment drift, to a dozen mundane explanations that, taken individually, sound reasonable enough. But a physical chamber, reached by a physical passage, containing a physical formation that resists easy classification, that is a different category of evidence entirely. It does not erase the uncertainty. If anything, it deepens it. But it changes the nature of the question the team is now asking. They are no longer wondering whether something is down there. They are standing inside the answer to that question and trying to understand what it actually is. There is also, in this discovery, a quieter and more human thread worth pausing on. The private reactions of the people who stood in that chamber, away from cameras, away from the pressure of public explanation. Multiple accounts describe a noticeable shift in mood among the team in the hours following the discovery. Not celebration exactly, but something closer to a subdued, careful excitement mixed with genuine unease. Conversations reportedly grew quieter. People who are normally quick to offer theories on camera became more measured, more hesitant to speculate beyond what the data could support. This is worth noting, because it reflects something important about how seriously this particular discovery was treated internally, distinct from how discoveries are sometimes framed for an audience. Several team members, in later reflections, acknowledged a gap between what they were comfortable stating publicly and what they privately suspected. This is not evidence of concealment. It is, in many ways, the opposite. It reflects a scientific culture that understands the difference between a compelling hypothesis and a proven conclusion, and refuses to blur that line simply because the discovery felt significant in the moment. That restraint, uncomfortable as it may be for an audience hungry for answers, is part of what makes this investigation credible rather than sensational. There was also, according to several accounts, a lingering sense of vulnerability that followed the team out of that chamber, an awareness that they had gone further into the unknown territory of this ranch than almost anyone before them, and that whatever they had found was not going to resolve itself simply because they wanted it to. One researcher, reflecting afterward, noted that the hardest part of the entire experience wasn't the discovery itself, but the responsibility that came with it, the obligation to represent what they found honestly, without inflating it into something more definitive than the evidence allowed, and without minimizing it simply because it defied easy explanation. That tension, between wanting answers and respecting the limits of what the evidence can currently support, sits at the center of how this discovery has been handled since. There is a particular kind of discipline required to walk away from a discovery like this without overstating it, and it showed in how the team handled the days immediately following the expedition. Internal briefings were reportedly cautious, almost clinical in tone, even among people who privately admitted the experience had unsettled them. Draft reports were revised multiple times, not to soften the findings, but to ensure that every claim was backed by something measurable, something another researcher could independently verify if given access to the same data. That process, unglamorous as it is precisely what separates a credible investigation from a sensational one. And it is, in its own quiet way, part of the story this episode is trying to tell. In the weeks following the initial breach, the passage and chamber were secured, both for safety and for the integrity of ongoing research. Monitoring equipment was left in place to track the anomalous readings over an extended period, to determine whether the magnetic spikes, radiation variance, and localized cold spots were consistent features of this environment or fluctuating phenomena tied to conditions not yet understood. The plans were made for further, more detailed analysis of the formation itself, conducted with additional expertise and more advanced equipment than could be brought underground during the initial expedition. What remains unresolved is, frankly, most of it. The precise nature of the formation discovered in the chamber. The explanation, if one exists, for the instrument anomalies that seem to concentrate specifically in that section of the passage. The full extent of the tunnel system itself, which based on preliminary indications, may continue well beyond the chamber the team was able to reach on this expedition. And the larger question, the one that has quietly driven this entire line of investigation for years, whether this tunnel system connects, in some physical, measurable way, to the decades of surface phenomena that first drew serious attention to this ranch. None of these questions have been answered, and it would be dishonest and a disservice to the seriousness of this investigation to pretend otherwise, simply to deliver a tidier ending. What this breakthrough represents, ultimately, is not a conclusion. It is a threshold. For years, this ranch has offered fragments, a strange light here, an unexplained reading there, a pattern too consistent to dismiss but too incomplete to confirm. This tunnel, and the chamber at the end of it, is the first time investigators have been able to physically stand inside one of those fragments, rather than simply observing its effects from a distance. That alone marks this as one of the most significant developments in the ranch's long, unresolved history. But significance is not the same as resolution. The team who stood in that chamber did not walk away with an answer. They walked away with a new, more precise set of questions. Questions grounded, for the first time, in something they could touch, measure, and document, rather than merely infer. Whatever lies beyond the reach of that lighting rig, deeper along a passage that continues to descend into darkness the team has not yet fully explored, remains exactly that, unexplored. The mesa has not finished revealing what it's been holding beneath its surface for however long this tunnel has waited there, undisturbed, until now. And so the passage remains sealed for now, monitored, respected, waiting for the next expedition to pick up where this one was forced, by caution, and by the limits of a single day underground, to stop. Somewhere beneath that mesa, past the chamber, past the formation nobody could fully explain, the tunnel continues. Nobody yet knows how far. Nobody yet knows what else it's been quietly holding, all this time, in the cold and the dark, waiting for someone patient enough and careful enough to keep going. If there is one thing this ranch has taught everyone who has ever tried to study it seriously, it is this. The ground beneath our feet is rarely as settled as we assume. Sometimes it takes years of quiet suspicion, careful data, and disciplined patience just to earn the right to ask the next question. This breakthrough didn't close a chapter in the story of Skinwalker Ranch. It opened a door into one that had been waiting, sealed and silent, for longer than anyone standing in that chamber could have guessed. And somewhere beneath that mesa, in the dark, that door is still open.